Hey guys, so get this. It's April. April! My birthday is tomorrow, and there is another snow day. I'm so frustrated. Why does this happen? So I figured I might as well make another video. So this video is going to start with World War II in action. We already talked about how the war started. We talked about how the United States got involved. So this is kind of focusing on what was happening in the war after the United States was already involved and some of the styles of fighting. So just to recall, Hitler had been using a style of fighting called Blitzkrieg. He would use all of his forces all at once. So air raids, submarines, so naval if that was possible. He would use ground forces, he would use tanks, he would just everything he had, he would use all at once because he wanted to attack and overwhelm the enemy so that he could move really quickly. It was called Lightning War. And that worked actually because when the war started, and France and Great Britain had declared war against Germany because he had invaded Poland. He surprised France by, instead of meeting them along their actual shared border, he invaded Belgium and then attacked. He kind of like went around the line and then he quickly took over Paris. And back in those days, if you took over a country's capital, you officially took over the country. So he had already gotten France, and that means that Great Britain was sort of like the last holdout. There was the Battle of Britain, where for 200 days the Germans attacked, especially London, day after day, just like slamming them. But it was unsuccessful because Britain was able to hold out, and Hitler decided not to do a land invasion because he thought it would fail. In the meantime, on December 7th of 1941, the Japanese bombed the United States in a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, trying to destroy the U.S. Navy. It was unsuccessful that they weren't able to completely destroy the U.S. Navy, but it did succeed in bringing the United States into World War II, even though the United States was already kind of leaning toward supporting France and Britain anyway. Okay, so now it is late 1941. The situation is becoming more desperate. The German submarines had been attacking Allied ships which were crossing the North Atlantic, going from especially the United States to Great Britain because we were selling them supplies. We used cash and carry at first, and then the North Atlantic Charter. We had pledged our future loyalty to each other between us and Britain. The Axis forces, so now we're talking about primarily Russia, Italy, Germany, obviously, and then Japan. Those were the major ones. They occupied Greece and Yugoslavia, and they also invaded North Africa. And then Hitler surprised Stalin, and he actually turned on Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union. So the United States, and like when the United States got involved in the war, they were angry about Japan bombing Pearl Harbor. So obviously they wanted to invade Japan, but they decided that they would concentrate their efforts on defeating Germany and then would make a full attack on Japan. So right now we've got like three, actually almost like four major fronts. So between Great Britain and, well, France, I guess, because the Germans were trying to invade Great Britain. Then we have Hitler opened up a new front on the Eastern Front where he attacked the Soviet Union / Russia. Those are the same thing. And then also they invade North Africa. That was mostly for the Italians because they wanted to take over Ethiopia. They wanted some land in North Africa. So, and then we also have the war in the Pacific where the Japanese are trying to invade all of the Pacific Islands. They've already taken a bunch of China, and the United States has their naval base in Pearl Harbor. in the Pacific. So they're so the United States is fighting on multiple fronts. Everybody's fighting on multiple fronts. That's one of the struggles with World War II, is the strategy of where do you put your energy. China and the Soviet Union, then after Hitler betrayed Stalin, and then China had been just trying to stay out of it the whole time, but then they decided they had to join because Japan had been invading them. They were taken over by communists, by the way. China had a communist revolution in the middle of all this, and yeah, so things are complicated. So the style of fighting has changed a bit because there were some new inventions, including sonar. Sonar actually made it much more difficult for the Germans to defeat the British, because now the British could sense where their submarines were, and also they're starting to be able to use radar to figure out where their planes were. They also were able to use long-range bombers, and that's going to make it easier to fend them off in the North Atlantic. So that's more by Great Britain. But they focused on, the Germans were focused on destroying Allied supplies. So that's why they would, so that's why they were attacking, especially that supply lane on the North Atlantic. In the meantime, when we were fighting back against the British, what we were attacking were their factories, military centers, and railroads, because for them, the same thing, we were trying to cut their supplies and make them have to drop out of the war through that. In North Africa, there were a few major people that were kind of facing each other there. First of all, the German general who was leading the forces in North Africa was named Erwin Rommel. His nickname was Desert Fox. And then the British general who was fighting against him was Bernard Montgomery. And then one of the most famous battles there was the Battle of El Alamein, and that was in Egypt in 1942. And obviously the Allies won that one. Dwight Eisenhower was the representative from the United States who was fighting in North Africa, and he was also successful there. And if you guys remember, he's later going to become the US president after the war was over. German forces in Africa were surrendered by early 1943. So that was a successful area. So remember, we're kind of trying to concentrate one area at a time, or as much as we can on one area. North Africa was probably the easiest to keep them out of, like kind of kick them out of. Allied troops landed, so they invaded Italy, Sicily in July of 1943. Sicily is actually just an island off of Italy, and then they kind of used that to get a foothold in Italy and move their way. The Italian government actually ended up overthrowing Benito Mussolini, which causes Italy to drop out of the war. But Germans still were fighting to try to stop the Allies from invading through Italy. So it slowed them down, but still, after about 2 years, the Allied troops drove the Germans out of Italy by May of 1945. But the important thing was that Italy was no longer going to be supporting the Axis powers. So there was some major turning points during that war. As far as the Soviet Union, remember that I told you that Hitler betrayed Stalin and he attacked Stalin even though they had made a pact. They had made a pact of non-aggression toward each other before the war actually started, and they had agreed to divide Poland. Well, what happened was that Hitler got really, I think all along he planned to betray Stalin. He got too impatient, however. So I think, like most historians argue, that if Hitler would have waited to attack Russia until after he had defeated Great Britain and the Japanese were already kind of taking care of the Pacific, that he would have been successful in taking over the Soviet Union. But he got impatient and he attacked Russia early, and he attacked Russia and made it so they had to go to battle in winter. And that's always been a major mistake because of, like, where between Germany and Russia, I should have put a map on here, but between Germany and Russia, there's like there's mountains, but is also a large expanse of really, really, really cold tundra. I think we classify it as tundra. So in the past, a lot of people have tried to invade Russia, but the big mistake is invading Russia in the winter because it's really, really harsh conditions. And as far as Germany was concerned, they weren't prepared. They didn't have all of the supplies they needed. They weren't dressed properly. They were using summer uniforms. And they get stuck trying to invade Russia or the Soviet Union. And one of the most famous battles is called the Battle of Stalingrad, where literally what happened is the Soviet Union, the people living there, just held out, and they held out for the winter so long that eventually the Germans had to surrender to them by January of 1943 because the Germans were starving, they were freezing, and the Russians were just surviving. Like it was a really, really, really terrible, deadly battles. In fact, of the entire World War II, it was one of the most deadly battles. Another major one was the Soviet victory at the Battle of Kursk, which marked the end of Germany's effort to conquer the Soviet Union. They had to kind of quit on that front because they realized it wasn't going to be successful. By the way, do you know that Germans have a really famous record of, is that the right way to say that? They're famous for, rather than surrendering their cities, because if you invade Russia, like Russia is so remote, like it's so big and so spread out that their cities are really spread out. So if you invade Russia, like you're probably not going to be able to carry enough supplies with you for your troops. You're going to have to rely on getting their supplies. So what they would do is, rather than give up their cities, rather than give up their supplies, they would burn their cities to the ground so that the invaders could not refuel, basically. And that was incredibly successful for them. Russia, I don't think, other than by the Mongolians, Russia has ever been taken over, from the outside at least. Okay, meanwhile, in France, George C. Marshall was the U.S. general who supported an invasion of German-occupied France. So at this point, up until this point, for the most part, the Allied forces were on defense, and George Marshall wanted to go on to offense. So the famous battle where the Allied forces invaded France is called D-Day. And they invaded Normandy, which is right like across the English Channel. So if you guys can, again, I should have had a map. If you guys can imagine, England is up here and France is right below it. And there's like a channel. I think it's not very long. People have swum across it, but so they actually it was just right over the English Channel. So the cool thing is that the way it worked is they actually taxied over, like, so they shipped over taxis and stuff to drive into France off of Normandy, and they also landed a bunch of paratroopers behind enemy lines in the middle of the night. So when the Battle of Normandy happened, it was like the largest in history ever air, land, sea invasion. So it's kind of ironic because they almost used like Hitler's style of fighting as much as they could, like that blitzkrieg. And that was successful. They won the D-Day invasion on June 6th of 1944. So they were able to take back over Paris by August of 1944. And I already told you that back in the day, if you wanted to like win, you would just have to take over the enemy's capital, and that would kind of signify that you had won. Omar Bradley was the general who led U.S. forces from the breakout from the Normandy beaches, and then George Patton he was like the commander of the tanks, and he broke through German lines and was able to help liberate Paris. So we're talking about Marshall, Bradley, and Patton, who were the major generals, U.S. generals who were involved in that invasion of France. And then finally, another major turning point would be the Battle of the Bulge. So this was kind of like the last ditch effort for Germans to counteract that offensive that the Allies were conducting. So that was their big fight back. And so kind of I think it was kind of a mistake. They put all of their energy into the Battle of the Bulge, and they were trying to stop the Allies from invading Belgium. And so that was like them fighting back with everything they had. And when they lost that, it kind of knocked the wind out of them and made it impossible for them to try again and to come back from that. So by the beginning of 1945, the US and British troops were preparing to enter Germany from the west, while the Soviets were going toward Berlin from the east. So they were kind of coming both ways. Now, keep in mind the Holocaust had happened, so they were discovering this from two sides. So we'll get more into the Holocaust, but yeah, it was an eye-opening time, I think, for invading troops. We're going to continue now talking about the war in the Pacific and how that went down. Now, recall, Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the war, and up until that point, they had been really busy taking over as much land as they possibly could in the Pacific. They were being led by General Hideki Tojo, and by 1942, they controlled the British colonies of Hong Kong and Singapore. They had also invaded the British colony of Burma, and they controlled the Dutch East Indies. After they bombed Pearl Harbor, the Japanese moved really quickly because they wanted to take over the U.S. territories in the Pacific before the United States was able to mobilize and get in the war. So they took over Guam and Wake Island, and they invaded the Philippines. That is about when the United States was able to show up and defend the Philippines. Because, I don't know if you know this already, but the United States actually controlled the Philippines for a really long time after the Spanish-American War. When they kicked the Spanish out of the Philippines, then it was kind of weird. Like the United States replaced the Spanish as sort of colonizing the Philippines and then eventually kind of slowly released them. So it was General Douglas MacArthur who led the American and Filipino forces. So the attack on the Philippines on part of the Japanese was successful. They were able to drive the Americans out of Manila, and so they forced the Americans to retreat from Manila, which Manila is the capital of the Philippines. So like I said, back in the day, if you took over a capital, you've taken the whole place over. So FDR commanded MacArthur to go to Australia to get his troops out of there, as many of them as he could. And MacArthur vowed, "I will return," and he did. He did. So the U.S. and Filipino forces had to surrender to the Japanese in the Philippines. So this led to the Bataan Death March, and this is really famous. I actually met a guy one time that survived it, and really few people survived that. It was more than 70,000 Americans and Filipinos that participated in this that had to march. So they marched about 65 miles to prison camps. A lot of them were wounded and sick. So people don't actually know how many people died on the Bataan Death March, but they think between 400 and 1,000 Americans and maybe even 10,000 Filipinos died on the Death March. So by 1942, it looked like the Japanese were unstoppable in the Pacific. So the Americans had fled and brought their forces to Australia, and it was starting to look like the Japanese were going to invade Australia, maybe even Hawaii. So Chester Nimitz was the commander of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. And the turning point sort of for them was that Navy experts were able to break through Japanese codes and find out that they were about to attack New Guinea. So they got ahead of them, and they were able to attack and sink a Japanese carrier, and they called it the Battle of the Coral Sea. And they damaged another one, and this was the first time that they were able to kind of slow Japan down in the war. That was the first major win on part of the United States. So then that brings us to the Battle of Midway. In the Battle of Midway, it was carrier-based planes that were fighting against each other, so Japanese and American. Both were trying to sink each other's aircraft carriers, and the United States was able to successfully sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, and the Japanese only sank 1 American aircraft carrier. So this kind of crippled them for the rest of the war, and it finally put the Japanese on defense. I don't know if you guys are hearing this pattern in World War II, but it's really important that, as far as strategy is concerned, it seems that most often the easiest way to be successful in a war is to make sure that you're usually on offense, not defense. The only kind of caveat to that, the only change to that comment would be that there have been some successful wars where the side that's on defense did a lot of like guerrilla warfare, and they were just able to out survive the other side. That might be sort of like the Soviet Union. They just out survived, and that can also be successful. So then the Japanese focused their efforts on building a major aircraft landing site in Guadalcanal. And if they were able to do that, it would really strengthen them, and it would allow them to threaten the sea links between Australia and the United States. And remember, supplies are everything in war. So that was kind of a supply line that we needed to defend. So we went hard attacking Guadalcanal and finally won in 1943. So that's once again going to be a major American victory. So then the United States kind of changes their tactics now that they're on offense. And so they start practicing something called island hopping, where the goal would be to take over the little islands surrounding Japan one by one, kick the Japanese off, and then kind of work their way toward the mainland. And they wanted to finally capture Japan. So this strategy started in late 1943. It was brutal, honestly. It was brutal because every island was different, and the Japanese style of fighting, especially concerning their culture, is that it is honorable for a warrior to die in battle. And if they didn't die, they're supposed to commit suicide. So people had absolutely nothing to lose. So if an American force was able to successfully take over an island, as soon as they'd get to the soldiers, rather than letting themselves be captured, they'd kill themselves. So it was really, really a brutal way to fight. So as the Allies captured the islands, they would use them then as bases to bomb the Japanese mainland and then to attack Japanese cargo ships, once again trying to attack the supply lines. In October of 1944, the Allies prepared to invade the Philippines. And then in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, it was the largest naval battle in history, where the Allies were able to significantly reduce the strength of the Japanese fleet. Once again, another turning point in the war, because for Japan, their largest strength was their navy. So every time the United States or the Allies were able to take a hit on their fleet, it would greatly reduce their strength. So the Allied victory in the Philippines did take months, but they were able to finally succeed in taking over the Philippines. So in the air raids on Japan, there was so much, like, the United States were attacking mostly. They were trying to attack major cities that were supply cities, so cities that built weapons, they attacked those. But in the process, a lot of civilians died. In fact, in the past, when my students had done research on like the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we found out that there was actually more deaths caused from the air raids on Japan on part of the United States than even in in the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So as the United States were working their way closer and closer to Japanese mainland, they were trying to take over Okinawa. The Japanese were using kamikaze fighter pilots to crash their planes into U.S. aircraft carriers. So a kamikaze means the great wind, and actually, I think it's every year tsunamis hit Japan. I think I'm right about that. But these tsunamis, they used to call them kamikazes. So, like I said, the Japanese warrior culture was very like honor based. So they literally trained pilots to be suicide pilots, and they were called kamikaze. They were really really difficult to um, to fight against because they had nothing to lose. So you couldn't. A lot of they were hard to hit because they were planes. So you had to have really long range missiles to actually get them. Um, and and like I said, there was nothing to lose, so they would keep coming even if it looked like they were going to get hit. The Japanese casualties in the battle for Okinawa were extremely high. There were more than 110,000 that died. For the Allies, 12,000 dead and about 37,000 wounded. And then the Allied victory at Okinawa begins to set the stage for invading the Japanese homeland. In this final section, we're going to be talking about the end of the war and how that happened. So the Allies had made significant advances in the Pacific. They were moving toward the Japanese mainland. They had successfully taken over Okinawa. And now we are on to how the Allies won victory in Europe. In 1945, the Allies hit the cities like Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg hard. These are German cities because those were centers of weapons factories. But in the meantime, they also killed a significant amount of civilians. And then the British and US rushed across the Rhine River before the Germans could destroy the bridges because they wanted to move closer and closer to taking over all of Germany. And don't forget, the Soviet Union had been hitting Germany from the other side. Some Allied leaders wanted to occupy as much as Germany as possible to keep the territory out of Soviet control because there's a lot of concern, especially after the Battle of Stalingrad, that the Soviet Union would completely brutalize Germans. So as Soviet troops moved toward Berlin, Hitler committed suicide on April 30th of 1945, and then just a few days later, on May 8th of 1945, the Germans surrendered unconditionally. So this is what we call VE Day, or Victory in Europe. And then FDR actually, right before VE Day, died. I think he had a stroke or a heart attack. And then his vice president, Harry Truman, took over president right after he died. So it was kind of like all things all at once, kind of culminated as the war was coming to an end. So now that Europe had been kind of taken care of, Africa had been taken care of, the last war front to be left was in the Pacific against the Japanese. So after Truman became president, he found out about something called the Manhattan Project, which was a secret government program where they were trying to build an atomic bomb. They actually had employed more than 600,000 people trying to build the bomb. So that was, yeah, a lot of them. They were able to successfully test the bomb in New Mexico on July 16th of 1945. So this kind of brings Truman to the decision of whether or not he should bomb the Japanese mainland. The problem was that, and I think that this is a really complicated problem, but so you should do a little more research on this, but the United States knew that if they dropped the bomb, that it would change the world forever. Like the bomb was something that it was an incredibly, incredibly powerful tool. Let me just pause this. My computer is dying. Okay, I fixed it. They knew that the bomb was really powerful, that using the bomb would change the world because that was a weapon that was so destructive that it could literally destroy the world if you used enough of them. But ultimately, they decided that if they tried to invade the Japanese mainland, especially because of the pattern of suicides and kamikaze bombers, they knew they also had intelligence to know that they were training Japanese citizens, including children and women, on how to fight against the United States if they got, or I'm sorry, against the Allies if they were invaded. They knew that invading Japan would be a terrible, bloody slaughter. So ultimately, Truman sent sent a message to Japan demanding them to surrender, and they refused an unconditional surrender. So on August 6th of 1945, they decided to drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. And then when Japan still did not surrender, 3 days later, they dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki, August 9th of 1945, and this caused Japan to finally surrender. The cost of the war was astronomical. World War II cost the lives of about 50 million people. A lot of them were civilians. It devastated the economies of Asia, Europe, and Soviet Union. However, the United States emerged from that as the most powerful economy in the world. And I would say that we're probably still close to the same place. So that's the summary of World War II. I think when we look back on World War II, I think what we talk about a lot is the Holocaust, but we don't talk as much about just the cost of the war and what people were willing to do. Like, to me, when I reflect on the war, I think about how crazy it was that Japan was so brutal, especially to the Chinese, and everyone they came across. So, and yet we just don't talk about that very much. And the fact that the United States chose to kill like over 100,000 people all at once in a couple minutes when they dropped the bomb. The fact that millions of Russians died in Stalingrad, like it seems like an oversimplification to just talk about the Holocaust because there's so much that goes into World War II and so many sides to it, that I think it's just important to see the whole thing and to really think about the whole thing. Yeah, and the way that war impacts economies, it's kind of amazing. The fact that the United States, when we look at the wealth of the United States right now and the strength of the United States, the fact that a lot of that was really established in World War II, I think it's something that we need to not take for granted. So that's my summary. I hope this was informative for you.